When confidence met the future, February 1991, the desert of southern Iraq looked quiet on the surface, but underneath that calm sat one of the largest armored forces assembled since World War II. The Republican Guard, Saddam Hussein's pride and joy, was dug in, positioned, and confident. These weren't raw recruits. These were veteran formations. Men who had survived 8 brutal years fighting Iran. Men who believed they understood modern war. They had Soviet doctrine. They had T-72 tanks. They had layered defenses, prepared fighting positions, and numbers that looked good on paper. And most of all, they believed the Americans would fight the way everyone else always had. That belief would destroy them. What the Iraqi commanders didn't grasp, what they couldn't grasp yet, was that VII Corps wasn't just another army rolling forward. It was the physical expression of everything the United States had learned during the Cold War. Decades of studying Soviet armor. Decades of war gaming this exact scenario. Decades of asking one question over and over again. How do you kill an armored force before it even knows it's being hunted? The answer wasn't bravery. It wasn't numbers. It wasn't luck. It was systems. American tanks didn't rely on eyesight alone. They didn't rely on muzzle flashes or guesswork. They saw heat. They saw engines running miles away. They saw Iraqi vehicles through sandstorms that blinded the human eye. While Iraqi gunners were staring into beige nothingness, American crews were calmly identifying targets on thermal screens like it was a shooting range back home. This wasn't a fair fight, and that's the point. At the operational level, VII Corps moved faster than Iraqi commanders could process. Units appeared where doctrine said they shouldn't exist. Flanking movements weren't just wide, they were overwhelming. By the time Iraqi radios crackled with warnings, American armor was already inside their decision loop. That's when panic starts to creep in. Not Hollywood panic. The real kind. The kind where reports don't make sense anymore. The kind where tanks are getting hit from directions that shouldn't be possible. For the Republican Guard, the war they prepared for simply never arrived. Here's the part people miss when they look back at Desert Storm with hindsight. The Iraqi Guard didn't think they were weak. They thought they were ready. On paper, they had what had worked for decades. Soviet-designed armor, massed formations, firepower measured in sheer volume. Against Iran, it had been enough. Against VII Corps, it was obsolete. American fire control systems didn't just help crews aim, they eliminated uncertainty. Targets were acquired, tracked, and destroyed at distances Iraqi crews had never trained to fight at. Over 3 kilometers. Sometimes more. Iraqi tanks often never knew where the shot came from. One moment they were holding position. The next, the vehicle next to them was burning. And then another, and another. Depleted uranium rounds didn't care about armor thickness charts from the 1970s. They punched through Soviet steel with brutal consistency. Hits that would have disabled older Western tanks simply erased Iraqi vehicles from the fight. Turrets blown off. Crews lost before they ever fired a meaningful shot. Meanwhile, American units weren't just shooting, they were coordinating. Real-time intelligence flowed from air assets to ground commanders. Satellites, JSTARS, forward observers, and armored cavalry screens all fed into one brutal truth. The Iraqis were visible, predictable, and trapped. This is where the shock truly set in. Captured Iraqi officers later described the same feeling using different words: confusion, disbelief, helplessness. They were fighting an enemy that seemed to know where they were at all times. An enemy that struck first, struck accurately, and never gave them a chance to reset. And this wasn't chaos on the American side. It was calm, methodical, almost routine. In just 4 days, VII Corps shattered 4 Republican Guard divisions. Over 1,350 tanks destroyed. More than 1,200 armored personnel carriers wiped out. Losses so lopsided they forced military historians to double-check the numbers. This wasn't just a battlefield defeat. It was the collapse of an entire way of war. The Cold War had been fought on maps, in simulations, in classified studies. In the deserts of Iraq, those theories finally met reality, and the result was unmistakable. The Republican Guard didn't lose because they lacked courage. They lost because they were standing still while warfare had moved on, and they had no idea what hit them. They fought a war they couldn't see. To understand why the Republican Guard collapsed so fast, you have to step inside their mindset before the shooting started. Iraqi planners weren't guessing. They were following a playbook they trusted. Soviet armored doctrine emphasized mass, layered defenses, and the assumption that both sides would see roughly the same battlefield. That assumption was fatal. What VII Corps brought to the desert wasn't just better tanks, it was battlefield awareness on an entirely different level. American commanders didn't rely on static positions or rigid plans. They operated with a fluid picture of the fight, constantly updated by sensors the Iraqis didn't even know were watching them. JSTARS aircraft tracked vehicle movements across vast distances. Satellites fed positional data. Air reconnaissance confirmed what ground scouts already knew. By the time an Iraqi unit settled into a defensive posture, American planners already understood its layout, strength, and likely reactions. And then came the sandstorms. In previous wars, bad weather slowed everyone down. Visibility dropped, movement stalled, and engagements became chaotic. But this time, the weather only affected one side. American thermal sights cut straight through blowing sand and darkness. Iraqi optics didn't. For Iraqi tank crews, the battlefield vanished. For American crews, it stayed crystal clear. That's when the psychological pressure really kicked in. Imagine sitting inside a tank, knowing the enemy is out there, but you can't see them. Shots start landing from distances you were told were impossible. Vehicles around you ignite without warning. Radio traffic turns frantic. Orders contradict each other. Nobody knows where the Americans actually are. This wasn't combat as the Iraqi Guard understood it. This was being hunted, and the Americans didn't rush. They didn't charge blindly. VII Corps advanced deliberately, maintaining spacing, overwatch, and constant coordination between units. Every movement was covered. Every contact was exploited. From the Iraqi perspective, it felt unreal, almost unfair. From the American side, it was execution of doctrine refined over decades. At the tactical level, the difference in training became brutally obvious. American tank crews trained endlessly on gunnery, target identification, and crew coordination. Every Abrams crew functioned like a machine: commander spotting, gunner tracking, loader feeding rounds, driver positioning the hull. Seconds mattered, and they were faster. Iraqi crews, by contrast, often operated under centralized control. Initiative was limited. Orders flowed downward slowly, especially once communications started breaking down. When those orders stopped coming, units froze or worse, moved blindly. Fire control made the difference almost obscene. The M101E system allowed accurate fire while moving, at long range, under poor visibility. Iraqi T-72s often had to stop to fire effectively. That pause, those few seconds, was enough. By the time an Iraqi gunner was lining up a shot, the American round was already on the way. And when it hit, it wasn't a warning shot. Depleted uranium penetrators didn't glance off. They didn't struggle. They went through. Tank after tank was knocked out before ever contributing to the fight. Iraqi armored formations dissolved not because they were surrounded, but because they were erased piece by piece. What stunned Iraqi officers afterward wasn't just the destruction, it was how controlled it was. No chaos on the American side. No desperation. Units maintained formation, tempo, and command even as resistance collapsed. This is why the numbers still shock people today. 4 days, 4 divisions, thousands of armored vehicles destroyed or abandoned. It wasn't luck. It wasn't overwhelming numbers. It was a system of systems doing exactly what it was designed to do against a Soviet-style army. By the end of this phase, the Republican Guard wasn't just defeated, it was disoriented. Survivors spoke of an enemy that always seemed one step ahead, one ridge over, one decision faster. The old rules didn't apply anymore, and the Iraqis were learning that lesson the hard way. The technology gap that ended the fight before it began. By the time VII Corps fully engaged the Republican Guard, the outcome was already leaning heavily in one direction, not because the Iraqis lacked courage or numbers, but because they were fighting a war designed in another era. Their doctrine, equipment, and expectations were shaped by Cold War assumptions that simply didn't hold anymore. Iraqi commanders believed armor battles would be decided by mass and positioning. That made sense on paper. Soviet-style warfare emphasized layered defenses, overlapping fields of fire, and forcing the enemy into predictable engagement zones. Against a peer force using similar technology, that approach could work. But the Americans weren't playing the same game. What the Iraqi Guard didn't fully grasp was that U.S. forces had quietly solved problems that armies had wrestled with for decades. Seeing first, shooting first, and killing first every single time. Detection meant destruction, and detection was no longer tied to daylight or clear skies. Thermal imaging changed everything. Abrams crews could identify heat signatures at ranges Iraqi optics couldn't even attempt. A tank hidden behind a berm, engines running. Crew inside it lit up like a flare. Iraqi units believed they were concealed. They weren't. They were being tracked from miles away. This wasn't just about better sights. It was about confidence. American crews trusted their systems. They knew what they were seeing was real. Iraqi crews, on the other hand, were firing at muzzle flashes, shadows, and guesses. Many later described shooting at nothing, hoping something was there. And while Iraqi gunners struggled to identify targets, American fire control computers were already calculating lead, elevation, and range. There was no hesitation. Once a target was confirmed, the engagement sequence was fast, calm, and deadly. Another factor rarely appreciated outside military circles was navigation. U.S. units maneuvered through featureless desert with precision. GPS, inertial navigation systems, and rehearsed drills allowed entire armored formations to move at night, maintain spacing, and hit exact phase lines on schedule. Iraqi units, by contrast, often became disoriented once contact began. Dust, darkness, and disrupted communications turned organized defenses into isolated pockets. Once that happened, those pockets were systematically eliminated. The Republican Guard wasn't collapsing because they were weak. They were collapsing because they couldn't adapt fast enough to a battlefield that no longer rewarded their strengths. One of the most underestimated aspects of the campaign was how thoroughly the Iraqis misunderstood American intent. They expected a cautious advance, heavy attrition, and slow progress. That's how wars between large armored forces were supposed to unfold. Instead, they faced relentless momentum. VII Corps didn't pause to regroup after each engagement. When resistance broke, American units kept moving. They bypassed wreckage, rolled past burning vehicles, and pressed deeper before Iraqi commanders could re-establish control. That tempo was devastating. For Iraqi leadership, this created a nightmare. Reports from the front were delayed, incomplete, or contradictory. Units that were expected to hold simply disappeared from the map. Entire formations went silent. When higher headquarters tried to react, the situation had already changed. This wasn't chaos on the battlefield, it was chaos in Iraqi command structures. Meanwhile, American commanders retained situational awareness throughout. They knew where their units were, where the enemy was likely to be, and where gaps were opening. That allowed them to apply pressure precisely where it mattered most. Firepower played its role, but discipline sealed the deal. American crews didn't waste shots. They didn't chase targets blindly. Engagement priorities were clear: command vehicles, armor, then support assets. Once resistance dropped, units shifted focus without hesitation. For Iraqi soldiers watching this unfold, it felt overwhelming. Survivors later described a sense of inevitability. No matter what they did, dig in, move, disperse, the result was the same. The Americans found them first. This is where the psychological shock truly set in. The Republican Guard had spent years fighting Iran in brutal attritional warfare. They believed experience would carry them through. But experience only matters if it matches the fight you're in. This fight was different. What they encountered wasn't just superior equipment, it was a doctrine built around information dominance, precision, and speed. a system designed to dismantle Soviet-style forces efficiently. And that system worked exactly as intended. By the end of this phase, it was clear to Iraqi commanders that holding ground wasn't just difficult, it was impossible. The battlefield belonged entirely to VII Corps, and the war, for all practical purposes, was already decided. When Soviet doctrine hit a brick wall, by the third day of ground combat, the Republican Guard wasn't just losing equipment, it was losing the logic of its entire war plan. Everything they had trained for pointed to a type of battle that simply never materialized. Soviet doctrine assumed parity. Desert Storm exposed the myth. Iraqi armored doctrine relied heavily on centralized command. Orders flowed top-down. Units waited for direction before maneuvering. That system works when communications are stable and the battlefield moves at a predictable pace. In 1991, neither condition existed. American electronic warfare and air dominance had already degraded Iraqi communications before ground forces even arrived. Radios were unreliable. Command posts were hit. Runners were slow and often never returned. By the time Iraqi commanders understood what was happening, their units were already engaged or destroyed. This is where U.S. decentralized command paid off. American tank platoons and companies were trained to operate independently once contact began. Junior officers and NCOs didn't wait for permission to act. If they saw an opportunity, they took it. That flexibility created cascading failures across Iraqi defenses. One Iraqi unit would be engaged and destroyed. Adjacent units, expecting coordination, found nothing on their flanks. Panic followed. Withdrawal attempts turned into traffic jams of armor and APCs, perfect targets for American gunners. And the Americans didn't rush. That's important. From the outside, it looked like overwhelming force. From inside the tanks, it was methodical. Identify, range, fire, move, repeat. No wasted motion, no drama, just execution. Many Iraqi crews never fired a single effective shot. Their tanks were knocked out before they could even confirm what they were seeing. Some reported hearing explosions without ever seeing the enemy. That's not a fair fight. And that's the point. The Cold War assumption was that wars between major powers would be brutal slugfests with massive losses on both sides. Desert Storm shattered that idea. It showed what happens when one side owns the information space. The battlefield no longer belonged to whoever had more tanks. It belonged to whoever could see, decide, and act faster. Another critical factor was combined arms integration. VII Corps wasn't just tanks rolling forward. It was armor, infantry, engineers, artillery, attack helicopters, and air support working as one machine. When Iraqi units tried to reposition, artillery cut them down. When they dug in, engineers breached obstacles under covering fire. When pockets of resistance appeared, attack helicopters moved in fast and finished the job. The Iraqis had seen helicopters before, but not like this. A-64 Apaches weren't just gunships. They were tank killers operating beyond visual range. At night, using sensors Iraqi forces had no answer for. To Iraqi crews, it felt like being hunted by something they couldn't hear or see until it was too late. Morale collapsed quickly after that. Captured Iraqi officers later admitted they had no effective counter. Smoke didn't help. Camouflage didn't help. Movement made things worse. Staying still wasn't safer either. Every option led to destruction. That realization spread fast. Once soldiers believe there's no action that improves survival, cohesion breaks down. Units stop functioning as units. Desertions increase. Surrenders spike. Equipment gets abandoned. This is exactly what happened. By the time VII Corps reached deeper objectives, resistance was fragmented and disorganized. Entire Republican Guard divisions ceased to exist as coherent fighting forces, not over weeks, but days. And that speed mattered politically and strategically. The United States wasn't just winning battles, it was demonstrating a new way of war to the entire world. Allies watched closely. Adversaries took notes. Military planners everywhere realized the same thing at once. Soviet-style armored warfare was obsolete. This wasn't just Iraq losing a war. This was an era ending, and the message was clear whether you were in Moscow, Beijing, or anywhere else still betting on massed armor. The rules had changed, and the Americans wrote the new ones. Night belonged to the Americans. If there was one moment when the Republican Guard truly understood they were outmatched, it was at night. Soviet doctrine assumed darkness slowed everyone down equally. Night was supposed to be a pause, a reset, a time to reposition, resupply, and regain control. That assumption died fast in the deserts of southern Iraq. For U.S. forces, night wasn't a limitation. It was an advantage. American tanks, Bradleys, and helicopters operated almost as comfortably in total darkness as they did during the day. Thermal imaging turned the battlefield into a glowing map of heat signatures. Engines burned white-hot. Human bodies stood out clearly. Movement was obvious. To Iraqi crews, the night was black, absolute black. Their optics were mostly passive or outdated infrared systems with limited range and poor resolution. Sand, smoke, and heat distortion made them almost useless. Many Iraqi gunners later admitted they couldn't tell whether they were looking at terrain, wreckage, or enemy vehicles. Meanwhile, American crews could identify targets at distances that Iraqi tanks couldn't even detect. This wasn't courage versus cowardice. It was physics. At 73 Easting, and throughout VII Corps' advance, American units engaged at ranges exceeding 2,500 to 3,000 meters. Iraqi return fire, when it happened at all, was often unaimed shots fired toward muzzle flashes or suspected positions. U.S. crews didn't need to guess. They saw the enemy first. They fired first. They hit first. And once a tank was hit by a depleted uranium penetrator, the fight was usually over in seconds. Internal fires, ammunition cook-offs, total kills. Some Iraqi crews bailed out immediately after the first impact, not because they were untrained, but because they knew survival odds were near zero. By night 2, fear of darkness spread faster than any radio message. Soldiers whispered about tanks that could see through sandstorms, about enemy vehicles that fired without warning, about invisible forces moving across the desert. From a psychological standpoint, that's devastating. War already pushes people to the edge. When the enemy feels supernatural, when normal rules stop applying, discipline cracks fast. That's exactly what American technology did. It stripped the battlefield of mystery for one side and filled it with terror for the other. It wasn't just tanks. The Bradley fighting vehicle played a major role and surprised nearly everyone, including the Iraqis. Armed with TOW missiles and advanced optics, Bradleys routinely destroyed Iraqi tanks at ranges that shocked observers. In some engagements, Bradleys achieved kills before Abrams tanks even entered the fight. That sent another message. American combat power wasn't concentrated in a single platform. It was distributed. Everywhere you turned, there was something lethal, accurate, and connected. Iraqi doctrine didn't prepare them for that. They expected tank versus tank engagements. Instead, they faced a layered system where every vehicle, every unit, every sensor fed into the same operational picture. And that picture moved fast. U.S. logistics kept pace without slowing the advance. Fuel, ammunition, maintenance all flowed forward efficiently. Vehicles that broke down were recovered quickly. Crews rotated. Command never lost momentum. The Republican Guard couldn't do that. Their supply lines were already degraded by weeks of airstrikes. Fuel shortages limited maneuvering. Ammunition resupply was inconsistent. Once units began retreating or repositioning without orders, logistical collapse followed. By day 4, many Iraqi formations weren't defeated in the traditional sense. They were simply finished out of fuel, out of ammo, out of options. Captured Iraqi officers later described the experience as fighting an enemy that never paused, never hesitated, never slowed down. That's not accidental. That's the result of decades of investment in training, doctrine, technology, and leadership development. Desert Storm wasn't a fluke. It was a system working exactly as designed, and the world noticed. Defense analysts, especially those still relying on Soviet-era models, took a hard look at the numbers. kill ratios that made no sense by Cold War standards. Entire divisions neutralized in days. The conclusion was unavoidable. The future of warfare wasn't about mass alone anymore. It was about information, integration, and precision. And in 1991, the United States owned all three. One of the least talked about but most decisive factors in VII Corps' destruction of the Republican Guard was something Iraqi commanders barely understood at the time: networked warfare. This wasn't just about better tanks. It was about how information moved. American units didn't fight as isolated formations. They fought as nodes in a system. Scouts fed data to commanders. Aircraft fed data to ground units. Satellites fed data to everyone. What one unit saw, others knew, often in near real time. For Iraqi forces, that concept barely existed. Most Republican Guard units relied on rigid command structures. Orders flowed top-down. Situational awareness depended on runners, radio calls, or outdated maps. Once communications were disrupted, and they were units became blind and static. Meanwhile, U.S. commanders had an evolving picture of the battlefield that updated constantly. That mattered more than raw firepower. At multiple points during the ground campaign, American units adjusted their axis of advance not because they encountered resistance, but because they already knew where Iraqi formations were attempting to regroup. Iraqi units would move at night, believing they were concealed. They weren't. Thermal sensors, JSTARS surveillance aircraft, and reconnaissance patrols tracked vehicle movement across the desert. Entire armored formations showed up on American screens as clusters of heat signatures creeping across empty terrain. There was no ambush advantage, no surprise. That alone broke a core assumption of Soviet-style doctrine: that maneuver could restore initiative. It couldn't, because initiative had already been stolen. Captured Iraqi officers later described issuing orders that were obsolete by the time they were executed. American forces had already repositioned, already bypassed, already set up kill zones. From their perspective, it felt like the enemy was always one step ahead. That's not luck. That's systems dominance. And it explains why losses mounted so fast. Another shock came from precision specifically. First round kill probability. U.S. tank crews trained relentlessly to hit moving targets at long range, often under poor visibility. Fire control computers adjusted for wind, barrel wear, vehicle movement, and range automatically. Crews confirmed the solution, squeezed the trigger, and watched targets disappear. Iraqi gunners didn't have that luxury. Many T-72s lacked advanced stabilization. Range estimation was often manual. Fire control systems, where present, were crude by comparison. In combat conditions, dust, smoke, chaos, the odds of a first round hit dropped sharply. That gap had consequences. In armored warfare, the first accurate shot usually wins. When one side consistently fires first and hits first, battles don't last long. They collapse. American crews routinely destroyed Iraqi tanks before the latter even realized they were under attack. Some Iraqi units mistook incoming fire for artillery. Others believed they were being hit by airstrikes. By the time they understood what was happening, it was already over. And this wasn't just Abrams versus T-72s. Apache helicopters roamed ahead of advancing columns, hunting armored vehicles and command posts. Iraqi air defenses, already degraded, struggled to respond effectively. Radar systems were either destroyed or suppressed. Manpads were limited in range and effectiveness. The battlefield had become three-dimensional. The Iraqi army was fighting on a flat plane. That mismatch wasn't something bravery could fix. Even Iraqi units that attempted aggressive counterattacks found themselves exposed, tracked, and eliminated before closing the distance. By the end of the ground war, the numbers told a brutal story. Entire Republican Guard divisions ceased to function as organized forces. Equipment losses reached levels unseen in modern mechanized warfare. Survivors described confusion, disbelief, and a sense that they had been thrown into a fight that belonged to another era. For U.S. forces. The campaign validated decades of doctrine and investment. For the rest of the world, especially militaries still relying on Soviet-era concepts, it was a wake-up call. The rules had changed, and anyone still playing by the old ones was in serious trouble. When doctrine collapsed, by the third and fourth days of the ground campaign, something critical had broken inside the Republican Guard, not just equipment, but doctrine itself. Soviet-style armored warfare was built around control, fixed positions, pre-planned fires, massed formations. Commanders expected to shape the battlefield before committing forces. That model depends on predictability. The Americans gave them none. VII Corps didn't attack where Iraqi planners expected. They didn't advance at a comfortable pace. They didn't stop to consolidate gains the way older doctrine assumed. They kept pushing, kept maneuvering, kept rotating fresh units into the fight. From the Iraqi side, it felt chaotic. Orders contradicted reality. Defensive lines were bypassed rather than assaulted. Units found themselves engaged from directions they hadn't planned for, sometimes from the flank, sometimes from the rear. And when doctrine collapses, confidence goes with it. Iraqi officers trained for years to execute a certain kind of war. What they faced in 1991 didn't match the playbook. There were no pauses to regroup, no safe rear areas, no clear sense of where the front line even was. American forces didn't just break through, they flowed around resistance. This wasn't recklessness. It was operational art backed by overwhelming awareness. U.S. commanders knew when to press and when to bypass because they could see the broader picture. That's the difference between reacting and controlling. Republican Guard units that attempted to stand and fight were isolated and destroyed. Units that tried to withdraw were tracked and hit on the move. Either way, the outcome was the same. By the time Iraqi commanders understood what was happening, their formations were already fragmented beyond recovery. Another moment of shock came when Iraqi crews realized American vehicles weren't vulnerable in the ways they expected. Soviet doctrine emphasized massed fire and closing distance. Iraqi tankers believed that if they could get within range, volume of fire might overwhelm U.S. armor. That never happened. M101 Abrams tanks absorbed hits that would have crippled older designs. Advanced composite armor and compartmentalization meant crews survived impacts that Iraqi crews would not. In many cases, Abrams tanks took hits, continued fighting, and destroyed the attackers. That's a morale killer. When you fire, hit the enemy, and they keep coming, people start to doubt everything they were taught. Meanwhile, American crews trusted their machines. They trusted their training. They trusted each other. That confidence matters more than people realize. U.S. units maintained tempo because they believed in their system. Iraqi units slowed down because they no longer did. Captured Republican Guard soldiers later described feeling like they were fighting machines, not men. That wasn't meant as praise. It was fear talking, and fear spreads. By the final hours of the campaign, resistance wasn't organized defense, it was scattered, uncoordinated, and often symbolic. Vehicles abandoned intact, crews surrendering without firing a shot, units melting away under pressure. This wasn't because Iraqi soldiers lacked courage. Many fought hard early on, but courage can't compensate for being outmatched in every measurable way. Vision, range, coordination, protection, and speed. The war had reached a point where outcome was no longer in doubt. What remained was the lesson, and that lesson echoed far beyond the desert. The age of massed Soviet armor as the backbone of modern warfare was over. The future belonged to those who could see first, decide first, and strike first. In 1991, the United States didn't just win a war, it rewrote the rules. By the time the shooting stopped, it was clear this wasn't just a regional conflict anymore. What happened in the desert sent shockwaves straight through military headquarters around the world, especially in places that still trusted Soviet-style equipment and doctrine. The numbers alone were staggering. In roughly 4 days of ground combat, VII Corps dismantled multiple Republican Guard divisions. Thousands of armored vehicles were destroyed, captured, or abandoned. Casualties were lopsided to a degree most planners thought belonged to history books, not modern war. This wasn't attrition, it was domination. Foreign military observers, some invited, some quietly watching from a distance, came away with the same conclusion: the gap was real, and it was bigger than anyone admitted. For decades, analysts argued that Soviet armor, en masse, could overwhelm Western forces. Desert Storm put that theory to bed permanently. It wasn't just Abrams versus T-70s. It was systems versus platforms, integration versus isolation, training cycles measured in years versus crews rushed through basic preparation. American forces didn't rely on heroics. They relied on repeatable processes. Identify, decide, engage, move on, over and over again. That rhythm broke opponents faster than explosives ever could. And it didn't go unnoticed. After 1991, militaries worldwide scrambled to modernize. Thermal optics became mandatory. Digital fire control stopped being optional. Networking units became the goal, not a luxury. Everyone was playing catch up. Because what VII Corps demonstrated wasn't just battlefield success, it was a preview of future war. Inside the Iraqi military, the shock ran even deeper. Survivors of the Republican Guard spoke openly, years later, about the psychological impact. Many said they never saw the enemy that destroyed them. Others described fighting targets they couldn't identify, firing at muzzle flashes while incoming rounds arrived with lethal precision. That disconnect was devastating. Commanders trained to control battles suddenly realized they were reacting to events they couldn't see, couldn't influence, and couldn't stop. And once that realization sets in, cohesion disappears. Equipment gets abandoned not because it's damaged, but because it feels useless. Orders get ignored because they no longer seem relevant. Units stop acting like formations and start acting like individuals trying to survive. That's when wars end long before ceasefires are signed. For the United States, the outcome reinforced something planners had believed, but never proven at scale. Investment in training, technology, and doctrine pays off exponentially when combined. It wasn't just better gear, it was better thinking. The kind of thinking that understands war isn't won by matching strength, it's won by changing the terms of the fight. By 1991, America wasn't trying to outnumber the enemy, it was outclassing him, and the rest of the world was paying attention. Because once you see that kind of dominance up close, you don't forget it. When the dust finally settled in February 1991, something uncomfortable became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a defeat for the Republican Guard, it was a collapse of an entire way of thinking about war. For decades, Soviet-style armored doctrine was built on the idea that numbers, mass, and toughness could offset technological gaps. If you couldn't see as far, you brought more tanks. If you couldn't shoot as accurately, you closed the distance. Desert Storm proved that logic was outdated. VII Corps didn't win because it had more tanks. In many engagements, it didn't. It won because it dictated every variable that mattered: range, visibility, tempo, coordination, survivability. American crews weren't guessing. They weren't reacting. They were executing. That difference matters. Iraqi forces fought with courage in places, discipline in others, but courage doesn't stop depleted uranium rounds at 3 kilometers. Discipline doesn't help when the enemy sees you through sandstorms and darkness like it's a clear afternoon. By the end, entire formations ceased to exist as fighting forces in less than a week. And here's the part that really rattled military planners worldwide. This wasn't the peak of American capability. It was the baseline. No experimental units, no prototype systems rushed into battle. This was standard issue U.S. Army doctrine, executed by crews trained to operate under stress, confusion, and speed. That realization hit hard. Because if this is what modern war looks like, then anyone stuck in the past was already behind whether they knew it or not. The legacy of VII Corps didn't end in Iraq. After 1991, armies around the world quietly reassessed everything: armor design, training pipelines, night fighting capability, command and control systems. The old assumptions didn't survive contact with reality. Even former Soviet analysts admitted the gap was wider than expected. And for American forces, the war validated a philosophy that had been building since the late Cold War: Don't just build better weapons, build better systems. Systems that talk to each other. Systems that reduce confusion. Systems that let commanders act faster than the enemy can think. That's how wars are decided now. Not by who has the biggest army, but by who controls the fight. The Republican Guard entered Desert Storm confident in their experience, their armor, and their doctrine. They exited it stunned, shattered, and facing a truth they couldn't escape. They weren't beaten by numbers. They were beaten by the future, and that future arrived fast, loud, and without warning. That's why this battle still matters. That's why military professionals still study it. And that is why 1991 marked the moment modern armored warfare crossed a line it could never uncross. Once you've seen that kind of dominance, there's no going back.